What have you done?
I just told a story, that's all.
That was one of the great experiences for me, really. Thank you, Ben. I think there are microphones picking up questions, but I'll repeat them if people have a hard time hearing them. So I'd like to open things up. Yes?
It was beautiful. Unbelievably beautiful. I'm a retired high school English teacher. I've taught Beowulf, but I don't claim I've ever understood it. I have a question about the script and then two little adjoining questions. Who wrote the script? Excuse me, let me use a Kenny. Who wrote the screen script?
Yeah, the screen text is a rather loose translation designed specifically for supertitles. Because if you did everything that's in the text that I'm singing, the titles would go too fast. And you'd be frustrated. So we had to sort of weed it out and get it down to the essentials. It was done by John Miles Foley, who was an Anglo-Saxonist at the University of Missouri. And he was, for some years, he was my mentor in Beowulf studies, and he prepared this. Yeah.
It was perfect. I mean, it just fit perfect.
Yeah, the idea was to not get in the way, not try to be poetic. I'm often asked why I don't use the Seamus Heaney translation, but the first reason is his publisher would never allow it. But the second reason is that his translation has so much of its own radiance and beauty that it would be quite distracting to have to read that and also hear the original. So we really opted for a text which was minimal and simple and just the facts, ma'am.
Two subsidiary questions about script. These are both early in the poem. This may be just a technical thing or a summary, so if it's too much, just let me know. I thought the line said, when chilled? I taught this, and here I am. Sorry. When he arrives as a baby in the waves, the line was something like, when he was found alone with, and then when he dies later, they heap up gifts on him. No quote, no fewer, the screen script, no fewer than the gifts or whatever he had with him when found as a baby alone on the waves. What does that mean?
Well, it's a little bit of irony, perhaps. It's kind of an Anglo-Saxon thing. Understated. Yeah, he came with nothing, and he left with everything. Yeah.
Oh, so it's sarcasm. It's a little irony.
A little bit.
Like you just said. Yeah. Second last. Great. This is so minor. Grendel lived for a while, we're told, in the home of his monsters, plural apostrophe, monsters race.
Yes.
Go ahead. What is that?
Well, it's trying to establish his cred, that Grendel is descended from the worst people imaginable.
Right.
And it's painting him into not only a monster in the sense of some kind of weird, misbegotten bunch, but he's also biblically bad.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I figured that was just too technical. Yeah, he's half human.
Oh, yeah.
We're told he's half human.
Yeah, he looks human from a distance at least, not when you get up close. I mean, anyone who can carry off 30 dead men in a pouch made of dragon skin is going to be large, very large person.
Thank you, sir. Sure.
Thank you. Yes.
Is this story still popular in Denmark today? Do they still tell it in Denmark?
Denmark is one of the worst places to perform this piece because it makes the Swedes look better than the Danes. It's not so great. So there's a lot of ancient stuff hanging over it there. The Danes are aware of it. It's not generally taught in school. And so it's for them as strange as it is for the Germans or for the Swiss or anybody else. They don't claim any particular affinity for it. Same goes for Sweden. It's kind of, Beowulf, yeah. It's an English, the Swedes say, oh, it's an English thing.
Yeah, hi. I had a question about your hair. You seem to have, I don't know whether you would call it a knot at the top,
yeah,
as well as the bridge at the bottom.
Yes.
And is there any evidence for that?
Yes, this was an idea of the. Here we go. This is what we discussed.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. This, the harp builder Reino Thurau in Germany was commissioned by the museum that contains the fragments of this harp. It's really quite fragmentary. Yeah. And you can see, however, in this corner only, the rest is gone, you can see that the wood of the harp, the corpus of the harp, is notched across here. And so he was puzzling out what could this notch have been. It was much too large just to affix some ornament. Yeah. Like the Sutton Hoo lyre has an ornament, metal ornament affixed here. But there was something here, obviously, and so he surmised it might be a kind of bridge at the top, which means that all the strings are exactly the same length. Yeah. Otherwise, if you have this arch with the pegs, the strings are not the same length.
Yeah, but they still work fairly well that way, like a four-post.
Yeah. The problem always for stringing up one of these instruments is that when you're winding the string around the peg, you're always trying to get exactly the same height as the other strings so that you don't have one that's here and one that's here, which causes trouble.
And so you're suggesting that was fixed since it had a notch?
It could have been simply held in place by the tension of the strings, as is the bridge. The bridge is a freestanding bridge. You can move it around.
It was just that I was interested because in the space in Psalter, the David definitely doesn't have one of those.
No, it doesn't. And also in that particular image, he's playing with one hand behind. Yeah. And there are indications that was a playing technique, and I think it is a playing technique. Like auto harp, you damp certain strings and strum them all. It's not the most interesting way to play, but I think for certain kinds of songs, I think it's totally valid as a technique.
Your playing is amazing. And you're much better in real life than you were in that Swedish DVD.
I love that one, though. I wanted to just make one quick comment and also ask you, Ben, in terms of your pacing, with music, because you're playing really a very simple scale, so it's actually almost hypnotically repetitious. It reminded me of going to synagogue and hearing the Chazan sing a little bit, only in a different kind of mode. How did you? It was words first, and then music. And how did you come to the pacing that you arrived at?
Well, it's not an intellectual process. I didn't sit down and map this out on paper and decide, okay, here I'll play a lot of this tone, and here I'll switch to another tone. It really happened over a long period of time. At the beginning, I had this huge amorphous blob of text, and the instrument, which has 6 strings, and once I had decided on the tuning of the instrument, the mode was set. And clearly you can't expect, as you say, variety in the course of a storytelling session. I'm not going to retune the whole instrument just to have a sense of variety. It doesn't serve a purpose. So, as in many storytelling traditions in the world that still exist, especially in Central Asia, it's no problem to have 4 tones or even 2 tones playing all the time, because they're not interpreting anything, they're not painting any pictures, they're not playing any music that's interpreting the story. They are simply supporting the singer. I do get a little bit into interpretation with what I'm playing, because for me 6 tones is a lot. Really, it's almost too much, and the way they can be combined in time and in articulation and in density, it's almost limitless. And that's when I, for instance, get into trouble in performance, when I find something new, usually by accident, and stumble into it, and I think, oh, this is great, I'll pursue it. And then I'm hearing something I'm not used to hearing, and I'm stepping outside of my own oral tradition, and I get briefly lost. And I have to kind of gather my forces and go back to the thing that I know best. So it's not a matter of creating melodies For instance, I've never had any music paper, any staff paper, where I've noted anything in writing. I just have the text, and everything else is just worked out in my head or in my memory as I do it. I never did any composing, let's call it. And also, what I'm playing is evolving all the time. It's even in the course of a performance, it can evolve. There are certain very set pieces in the whole story, which are almost always exactly the same. They have a beginning and an end. They're sort of dropped into the story, where time stands still and we're getting a comment, or we're hearing a story within the story, like the swimming contest. Those are moments where the time of the story stops and we're listening to somebody tell another story, which is a venerable tradition in storytelling. And then there are connecting materials. People are going somewhere, they're moving, there's a change of scene, or there are moments when I, as the shop, as the storyteller, I'm commenting on what's going on, and I'm sharing with the listeners my opinions. And I'm maybe even giving them a bit of my prejudices and how I feel about what's going on, which is a completely different world. And for that, I usually drop out of music altogether and go into more of a conversational tone. I always imagine it kind of in a bar when you're boring the person next to you with your opinions. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned time stopping. I've rarely had a sensation as acute as this of losing track of time. I mean, it seemed to go by in an instant, really. And of course, you're incredibly expressive, but it was almost shocking that it was over. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about your models for inventing a performance style. Mm-hmm. We could all say it reminds me of this or that. Seth mentioned the synagogue, which is, yeah, I get that. You mentioned Central Asia, but who are some of the performers, or what are some of the performance styles where you heard it, you were maybe even face to face, and you said, I want to do that?
Well, that's a very good question, because it kind of confronts us with our ability or inability to recognize the influences in our life. Because I had a normal classical music training. I went through conservatory, and I was always interested in earlier music. I never really fit into the whole piano. Sorry. The whole.
You're forgiven.
I never really fit into that mold. I was always orienting myself towards unusual things, and I was interested in world music, which in my student days wasn't nearly as accessible as it is now. You know, now you can hear anything, anytime, anywhere. But really, you had to get UNESCO LPs, and it was really hard to hear any kind of music not that was not commercial. And I did come across quite early, I think I was 15, and I heard a performance of Japanese medieval storytelling with a stringed instrument. And it's a very old tradition. There's one of the big Japanese epics. There's the Genji epic and the Heike epic. And the Heike epic is a 12th century story which traditionally was sung by blind Buddhist performers who held a kind of lute called a biwa, played with a plectrum like this. And it had 4 strings, and it had a very limited range, but it had enormous expressive possibilities. And I heard a performance by a woman who at that time was well into her 70s, who was the great national treasure of Japan, performing this music. And I had no idea what the text was about. I had a little description. 2 warriors meet on the beach, far from their fleets, and talk to each other before they have a duel, and one of them dies. And the one that killed him is sad about it. You know, that's all I knew. And this went on for 45 minutes, and the whole time I was completely transfixed by this. Because of the way the voice was being used with the instrument and the self-accompaniment. That was the thing that I think really had an effect on me. Now, nowhere in my performance am I imitating the biwa song of the Heike epic, although I would love to perform it in Japan once. I would really love to. But that idea of how time can be compacted, also time can be drawn out, it really showed me that this is possible, and kind of opened up a channel for me into another way of imagining music other than opera or ballads, for instance, which are very regular and tell a story over a long period of time in a regular strophic form. So that I would say is the only influence I can clearly identify. There might be some others, but that's certainly clear to me. Yeah.
I think there was one more question, and we'll end the evening with that. Yes.
What is the language, and does anybody understand it? Is it spoken across the dinner table?
It's English. It's what we call Old English or Anglo-Saxon. It's the English language as it was known before the time of the Norman invasion, which brought a French element into English. English became a peasant language spoken by lower classes, and all of administration and the church and everything was in Latin or in Norman French after 1066. So in this period before 1066, you have Old English, which is a Germanic language. And I have, for instance, Icelandic friends who tell me that two boats passing in the sea in the 10th century, one filled with Icelanders and the other filled with Englishmen, could probably carry on a pretty decent conversation, each speaking their own language, because it's that related. It's very close. And once I saw the modern Icelandic translation of Beowulf, which is a fantastic translation, it looks just like the original. It's amazing. It's not very far from the original at all. So you have these northern languages that share a lot of vocabulary, like Frisian, the language spoken in the northern part of the Netherlands, they understand a whole bunch of Old English. So your question about is it spoken today, no, not really, but certainly lots of words have come down to us. Here's a little fun fact about Beowulf. The first instance of the word naked is in Beowulf. Yeah. And it's about this, in the swimming contest, he says, "We had naked swords." Yeah. And that's the very first time it's used. It's not in reference to people, it's in reference to swords.
Quickie.
Yeah.
Quickie. Just please. I think you're a tough question. As a performer, and you've done this, and you're so good at it, I just want to know one little thing. What is the ultimate meaning of Beowulf in your opinion? The ultimate relevant meaning of Beowulf.
Well, it's certainly holding up for us, and I think for young men, and perhaps one particular young man who we can no longer identify, modes of behavior. And it's showing us how to behave in society and how to behave with your men and how to behave to make a functioning society where everybody does their part and where virtue ends up ruling. In the ending of Beowulf, I don't get to the end, of course, but in the end, the men don't really help him out as they had promised. They run away, and he's left with Wiglaf, who helps him to fight the dragon, and that's a big lesson right there, because we know that tribe or those people will not survive long. Once word gets out that the men ran away when they went after the dragon, there will be a song about that very quickly. And it will travel on boats, and other people will come quickly to fight because they know that these people have lost their backbone. So I think it's a message piece, but it's also it's couched in a monster story that a young man could appreciate and find interesting. There's an obsession with weapons and armor and all of that stuff. So it shows that sort of young male sensibility of being very interested in what the grown-up men are doing, So but it's definitely teaching a lesson to young aristocrats, I think.
I agree. And the antithesis to that virtue, that manly valor, as it is in all of Shakespeare's tragedies, betrayal, treachery, There's nothing worse than
Yeah.
breaking that trust.
Well, or not even betrayal, just not doing what you told them you would do.
Slow.
Yeah,
Thank you.
sure.
Well, we seem to be evolving very slowly, I suppose. Maybe things will quicken up. Ben, thank you so much for an absolutely unforgettable evening. Thank you
for
all
having
for
me.
coming.